Let's begin with the question almost everyone asks when they look at a war like this. Who is winning? Who is losing? Which side is stronger? Which side will come out on top? On the surface, those sound like sensible questions. But in a conflict like this, they are the wrong questions. They belong to an older model of war, a simpler model, where two armies collide, one side breaks, and the victor stands over the battlefield with a clear result. That is not the kind of conflict we are dealing with here. What we are witnessing is not just a military contest. It is a systems conflict. It is a pressure test on economic structures, alliance structures, political structures, and narrative structures all at the same time. And once you understand that, a much darker possibility comes into focus. The United States does not need to suffer a conventional defeat to come out of this weaker. In fact, the most dangerous possibility is that America can impose tactical damage, claim operational successes, protect some of its immediate interests, and still walk away strategically diminished. That is the real subject today. Not who wins the war on paper, but what this war does to the American system while it is being fought. Because once you zoom out and stop watching only the missiles, the aircraft, and the headlines, you begin to see the deeper architecture of the problem. The United States is not entering this conflict as a normal state. It is entering as the manager of a much larger global order. It has shipping lanes to defend, alliances to reassure, energy markets to stabilize, deterrence to maintain, and domestic voters to persuade. It has responsibilities in every direction. Iran does not. That asymmetry matters more than many people realize. In ordinary conversation, people hear the word asymmetry and think it simply means one side is weaker. But in strategic reality, asymmetry means something much more important. It means the two sides are not playing the same game under the same rules. The stronger side has more weapons, but also more obligations. The weaker side has fewer resources, but often more room to maneuver. The stronger side must manage perception, credibility, escalation risk, alliance cohesion, and public opinion simultaneously. The weaker side only needs to generate enough friction, enough uncertainty, and enough cost to make the stronger side's advantages harder and harder to use. That is the trap. Not defeat by force, but erosion by structure. And that is why the word victory becomes so misleading here. Iran does not need to destroy the United States militarily. It does not need to outmatch American air power, naval power, intelligence power, or industrial depth. That would be impossible. What it needs to do is redefine what success looks like. If it can turn every American move into something expensive, politically divisive, strategically inconclusive, and internationally destabilizing, then even American superiority becomes less useful. That is the essence of asymmetric strategy. You do not defeat the stronger side by meeting its strength head-on. You defeat it by making the price of using that strength higher than the strategic return it produces. And that is exactly where this conflict becomes dangerous for Washington, because the United States is a society where war does not remain on the battlefield. It comes home in the form of budgets, inflation, media narratives, election pressures, and social division. Every carrier deployment has a price. Every interceptor launched has a price. Every escalation decision has a price. And sooner or later, the public begins asking a brutal question: what exactly are we getting for all of this? That question is more dangerous than any missile, because wars are not sustained by firepower alone. They are sustained by legitimacy. A government must convince enough of its population that the cost is justified, the objective is clear, and the burden is worth carrying. Once that belief starts to crack, the conflict enters a different phase. The issue stops being whether the military can continue. Of course it can continue. The issue becomes whether the political system can continue absorbing the costs without fracturing. And this is where the domestic side of the equation matters so much. Modern war spending is not abstract. It is measured in billions upon billions of dollars spent on logistics, munitions, naval operations, surveillance, force protection, and regional deployments. That spending competes directly or indirectly with unresolved pressures at home: healthcare, housing, wages, education, infrastructure, food costs, and public debt. So, as the war continues, the economic burden does not remain a defense issue. It becomes a political narrative. People begin comparing what is being spent abroad with what has been neglected at home. And once that comparison becomes emotionally real, the war begins to lose strategic oxygen. At the same time, the international dimension becomes even more complicated. The United States has long been powerful, not just because it could destroy enemies, but because it could provide stability. That is a different kind of power, and in many ways, a more important one. Markets trust systems that appear governable. Allies trust powers that appear capable of maintaining order. Shipping lanes, trade routes, and energy flows are not side issues to American power. They are part of its foundation. And that is why the Strait of Hormuz matters so much. It is not just a narrow waterway in the Middle East. It is one of the most sensitive pressure points in the global economy. A substantial portion of the world's oil moves through that corridor. If it is threatened, partially disrupted, or perceived as unstable, the consequences spread far beyond the region. Energy prices rise, shipping costs rise, insurance costs rise, supply chains adjust, inflation ripples outward. And when inflation rises, it does not remain a geopolitical concept. It becomes a household problem. Food costs rise, fuel costs rise, transportation costs rise, and people who may not care about strategy suddenly care very much about the war because it is now affecting their daily lives. This is where the real strategic dilemma appears. If the United States escalates in order to restore credibility and secure the system, it raises costs, raises risks, and deepens domestic strain. If it does not escalate, it risks appearing hesitant, which can weaken deterrence and unsettle allies. In both directions, there is loss. One path bleeds money and cohesion, the other bleeds authority and confidence. That is what makes this a lose-lose structure, not because America is doomed in some dramatic cinematic sense, but because the available options all impose damage on the broader system. That is one of the hardest things for powerful states to admit. Sometimes the problem is not that they are weak. Sometimes the problem is that they are trapped. And the more powerful they are, the more responsibilities they carry, the more visible that trap becomes. Now add alliances to the picture, and the problem gets worse. Alliances are not machines. They are coalitions of interest, and interests are never perfectly aligned for very long in a prolonged crisis. European states may support American goals up to a point, but they have their own energy exposure, their own economic troubles, their own domestic politics, and their own limits on escalation. Asian powers that depend on stable oil flows will make calculations based on survival, not sentiment. Gulf monarchies will think first about regime stability. Nobody simply exists to validate Washington's preferred strategy forever. So even when allies remain formally aligned, variations in commitment start to matter. One country hesitates, another delays. Another insists on narrower objectives. Another worries more about inflation than deterrence. These may look like small differences at first, but over time, they accumulate into strategic drag. And that drag is exactly what a weaker adversary wants. Not a dramatic collapse of the alliance, but gradual friction inside it. Enough hesitation, enough cost, enough divergence that the stronger coalition starts weakening under its own complexity. And then we come to the deeper layer. The one most superficial analysis misses entirely. Systems are not held together by material power alone. They are held together by narratives. A country can have enormous wealth, enormous military capacity, enormous technological sophistication, and still begin to weaken if it loses the story that keeps its people aligned. That is why coordination matters so much. Mass matters. Energy matters, resources matter, but coordination is the multiplier. Coordination is what turns capacity into action. It is what allows a society to endure sacrifice, sustain focus, and interpret hardship as meaningful rather than pointless. And prolonged conflicts are dangerous because they fracture coordination. Different parts of society begin telling different stories about the same war. One says this is necessary to preserve order. Another says it is an elite-driven disaster. Another says it is morally urgent. Another says it is economically insane. Another says it is a distraction from internal decline. Once those stories diverge far enough, coordination starts falling apart. And once coordination weakens, even massive systems stop functioning at full strategic capacity. This is why decline is so often misunderstood. People imagine collapse as a single dramatic event, some spectacular breakdown that everybody can see instantly. But that is rarely how serious powers weaken. More often, they decay through compounding stress. They remain large, they remain armed, they remain formally intact, but they become less effective, less confident, less coherent, less able to convert power into outcomes. The institutions still exist, but they do not work with the same authority. The budgets still exist, but they buy less strategic clarity. The alliances still exist, but they require more management and deliver less certainty. The public still supports national strength in the abstract, but not indefinitely at any price. This is how external wars start reshaping internal systems. Not all at once, but slowly, through feedback loops. High costs reduce confidence. Lower confidence weakens coordination. Weak coordination produces worse outcomes. Worse outcomes reduce confidence even further. That is how systemic weakening becomes self-reinforcing. And when you bring all these layers together, economic pressure, alliance strain, strategic dilemmas, energy vulnerability, political division, and narrative fragmentation, you start to see why the process of the war matters more than the label attached to its end. Even if the United States achieves immediate objectives, the cost of doing so may have already altered the long-term balance. The domestic political system may be more divided. Allies may be more cautious. Rivals may be more encouraged. Markets may be more skeptical. The global perception of American control may already be weaker than it was before the conflict began. And if America fails to achieve those objectives, then the reputational damage accelerates everything even faster. That is why the old language of winning and losing becomes too crude. It misses the structural reality. In this kind of conflict, the battlefield result may be less important than what the conflict does to the system that wages it. So the real question is not, will America win? The real question is, what kind of America emerges from this process? Does it emerge more unified, more credible, more resilient, more capable of converting power into lasting stability? Or does it emerge more divided, more overextended, more expensive to sustain, and less trusted by both its citizens and its allies? That is the true stakes of a war like this, because great powers do not always fall when they are defeated. Sometimes they begin to weaken while they are still strong enough to claim victories. Sometimes the system deteriorates not because it lost a battle, but because the act of fighting exposed costs it could no longer absorb without consequence. And that is the conclusion people need to understand. In this kind of conflict, victory is not a shield against decline. If the structure of the war imposes enough pressure across enough dimensions for long enough, then even success on the battlefield may only disguise a deeper strategic loss. And once that happens, the damage is already underway long before the final headline is written. Wow,